The lesson is from the event-filled ninth chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Luke writes of Peter's confession before the disciples that Jesus is indeed the Christ of God, the Messiah. He writes of Jesus' direction not to tell this to anyone, and then writes of Jesus' prediction of his coming rejection, death, and resurrection. Jesus then warns the disciples that there is a cost of discipleship. If anyone wishes to be a follower of mine, Jesus says, that person must leave self and self-centeredness behind, take up his cross day after day, and come with him. Then Luke continues, beginning with the 28th verse. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, John, and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his exodus or departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and the disciples kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. A couple set their wedding date 12 months out. And over the next year, the bride and groom spent hours planning for all the details of the wedding. Okay, if truth be known, it was really the bride and her mother who spent all the time on the details. Men just don't have that spiritual gift, do they? She started a list, conjuring up all the details she could think of, where to have the reception, the guest list, the invitations, the flowers, her dress, the attendance dresses, the tuxes, the limos, the hotel. The list just seemed endless. But with 12 months to go, it seemed as if they had an eternity to plan for their perfect day. But then 3 months out, everything got frenzied. They thought they would never get it all done. But finally, the big day arrived. And the wedding ceremony was flawless. Everybody sitting there was so touched. When the groom pledged his vows to the bride, he got choked up and his voice cracked. The bride, by that time, was almost shaking, and she had to whisper her vows. Hardly a dry eye in the house after that. They went to the reception. The reception was great. The food was wonderful. The dancing was boisterous. Perfect meal. Everything was going exactly as they wanted. In fact, it was almost too good. Because as they sat there, they realized they didn't want the night to end. They wanted to hold on to it for as long as they possibly could. And I was wondering if any of you have ever had a moment in your life where you just didn't want it to end, where you wanted to hang on to what was going on and just stretch it for as long as you can. Can anybody think of an occasion like that you've experienced?
My first date with Martha.
First date with Martha. Just scored 10 bonus points. Anybody else? I can remember my Thanksgivings being like that, where we finally get the family all together and we're enjoying a meal together, and I just don't want it to end. I just want it to keep going. Maybe you've been on a trip somewhere and you're nearing the end of the time and you're thinking, oh, just 3 more days. Well, something like that happens in this morning's scripture passage, where the disciples want to hold on to the moment as long as possible. Peter even offered to build 3 tents with the idea that that would somehow freeze the moment. He could hold on to it as long as possible. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's see, our text begins with these words. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John and went up the mountain to pray. Wait a minute. What sayings? Beatty mentioned them. Jesus wanted to know what the word on the street was about him. So he said to his disciples, what's the word out there? Who do people say that I am? And the disciples start tossing out their words of what they'd heard. John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the ancient prophets. And then Jesus brought the focus down and the heat on and looked at them and said, but who do you say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Peter finally says, you're the Messiah of God. That's right, Jesus says, but don't tell anybody. Because we're going to Jerusalem, and I'll be rejected, and I'll be killed, and on the 3rd day raised. Then Jesus says, and anyone who wants to follow me, they must deny themselves, and they must pick up their cross and follow me. And while that's ringing around in their head, he says, for those who want to save their life will lose it. But those who will lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, they will save it. So with their heads spinning on these latest teachings, Jesus says, let's go. And he begins to lead them on a path southward to Jerusalem. On their way, they come to this mountain. Tradition says it's Mount Tabor. If you're to take a spiritual pilgrimage to the Holy Land, you'll probably go to Mount Tabor. And what you'll find is not a high mountain, but a really steep incline. And it says Jesus took 3 of his disciples and they marched up it. Well, you won't march up it, I can tell you right now. It's very steep, and the way to get to the top these days is with vans. And the vans go on these switchbacks back and forth until you're dizzy and you feel like you're about to fall over the edge. But when you get to the top, it's a special place. And you can see out across these fertile fields. And that's where Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him so that he could pray. And this is where the text becomes intriguing. Some would say an enigma. We read that Jesus is praying, and while he's praying, his appearance changes. His face glows. His clothes become a dazzling white. Suddenly, the disciples see two others with him, Moses and Elijah. They're talking to him about what he will accomplish in Jerusalem. How long did that conversation go on? Text doesn't say. I think it was one of those intense moments when you don't know if it's been 15 minutes or if it's been 2 hours. But Peter doesn't want the moment to end. It says Moses and Elijah are about to depart, and Peter runs over to Jesus and says, how about if we build 3 tents? One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. This is where he's just trying to hold on to it. But while he's doing that, a cloud comes in and overshadows them. A voice comes from the cloud that says, "This is my Son, the chosen. Listen to him." Suddenly, they just see Jesus standing there all by himself. And the text ends with these words, "The disciples kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen." Well, of course they kept their mouths shut. Can you imagine Peter at a dinner party and leaning over to the person next to him and say, "Hey, the other day we were on the top of Mount Tabor, and while we were there, Moses, who had been gone for 12 centuries, appeared, and also Elijah, who'd been dead for 9 centuries. They appeared there along with Jesus, and they talked, and then a cloud came in, and we heard God speak to them." And you can see the guy scooting away from Peter about as fast as he can go. Of course they didn't talk about it. What happened on that mountain? The 3 disciples experienced something strange, but also holy. Surely they struggled to make sense of it all. As they lumbered back down the mountain, I can see them casting glances at one another that said, "What was that all about?" Perhaps they thought that when they reached the bottom of the mountain, Jesus would unpack the experience for them. There are other occasions in the Gospels where Jesus tells a parable and the disciples don't get it, and so later he explains it to them. There are other times when they have some dramatic experience, they don't understand what it all means, and Jesus has to tell them what it's all about. So maybe they thought once they reached the bottom, when they had their feet on firm ground and they were with the other disciples, Jesus would explain it all. He never did. Our text says they were silent and they told no one what they'd seen. Maybe they were in shock. Or perhaps they held the whole episode in their pockets, hoping that in time they'd be able to grasp its full meaning. Now, as I pondered preaching today's text, this text shows up every year right before we begin Lent. And I felt that I was being lured into demystifying it for us. As I attempted to dig down into its meaning for our lives, I was tempted to give my best shot at making perfect sense of the whole account, but I resisted. Living in the 21st century, on the downwind side of the Enlightenment. It's tempting to try to explain away everything mystical in rational terms. All of the scriptures were written more than a millennium before the scientific revolution. And in our arrogance, we believe that we can analyze and quantify virtually everything in logical terms. One way to demystify a passage such as the Transfiguration is to approach it purely as a metaphorical story, something that was basically contrived by the author. We can identify the various elements in the story and then say what they mean. Now, the author has put Moses into this account because Moses represents the law. And he's pictured Elijah showing up with Jesus because Elijah represents all the prophets. In Jesus, we have both the law and the prophets perfectly combined. Next question. However, I wonder if we spend a bit too much time trying to explain things that simply defy logical explanation. Theologian Bruce Epperly points out that most Christians are skeptical of non-rational experiences, despite the fact that Judaism, Christianity, and all the major religions of the world all had their origins in mystical experiences. I think it helps for us to remind ourselves from time to time that there are simply experiences that defy rational explanations. Now, hear me right. I'm not arguing for us to become fundamentalist Christians that take every line of the Scripture literally. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that it wouldn't hurt to have a good dose of humility when it comes to thinking that we can explain every piece of Scripture and every episode in our own lives in logical terms. Now, we moderns rarely, if ever, have a mystical experience because we have disenchanted the world. We presume that every experience in life can be understood in terms of logic and reason. And if we happen to experience something that's totally puzzling to us, something that defies rational explanation, we either dismiss it or we assume that if we just had a bit more information, we could nail it down. But I think most people know in their soul that life includes more than we can understand, more than we can always explain. And isn't that why people become so attracted to music and poetry and trying to unpack dreams? These mediums give us impressions that expand life beyond mere reason and logic. As I've said before, Camilla and I were at the bedside of her mother 3 days before she died, and she glowed with a sort of white gold face, and she became very happy, and she started looking through the veil and started naming people who had already died that she could see in the last 3 days of her life. She was happy and ready to join them. Countless people have died on operating tables and been resuscitated, and they have come back to share with others what they experienced when their soul had left their body. Some of you have told me that you were visited by one of your loved ones after he died. and it was real but unreal. There's a woman who sits in our sanctuary sometimes and looks up at the resurrection window. And in that white behind Jesus that's radiant, sometimes she sees her mother, her father, her deceased brother. And it gives her great comfort to know that they're safely in God's hands. Is she merely imagining all of that, or is she seeing with the eyes of her soul? Could it be that, as Barbara Brown Taylor writes, our world is wonderfully porous? A world in which God's glory pulses just beneath the surface of things, and every once in a while, God's glory leaks in through some of the holes, bathing us and everything around us in brilliant light of transfiguring promise, of Easter hope, and an all-embracing divine presence. Or do we live in a world that's absolutely flat, just the way it seems, with no light, no holes, no fullness? Light is not always dazzling. Some say it never reveals anything new under the sun. But still, I wonder what would happen if we slipped off the blinders that are strapped so tightly around our skulls, restricting our view to what human reason declares possible. If we suspended our categories of what's logical and predictable, would we be open to thin places and sacred spaces and the treasures they have to offer? If we were open to the possibility of something we cannot fully grasp, might we stumble onto holy ground where we would be awestruck? I wonder. I wonder.